Arguably the most commonly under-scheduled, underappreciated, underplanned thing in game development is what I'll broadly call connective tissue. Connective tissue is anything where you are moving from one thing to another. In the case of storytelling, it's how you get from the end of Chapter 1 or Act 1 into the beginning of Chapter 2 or Act 2, or the end of a plot into the next plot. But it exists outside of the storytelling as well. It's how you get from walking around into combat, from combat into a conversation or into the loot screen. It's the stuff that connects the different parts of your game together. Very early in this channel, I talked about transitions as being one of the most complicated things in game development. And this is related to transitions, but where transitions is more about the act from an architectural perspective of moving from conversation mode into exploration mode, into combat mode, into a UI. This is about the philosophy of thinking about these movements. If you don't have a good transition between two different plots, people forget why they're doing things. They get lost and confused, and people don't like to be lost and confused. In fact, it's one of the major reasons why they'll stop playing your game at all. If the connection between exploration and combat doesn't exist, then you're just walking along and then suddenly you're in combat mode and there's literally nothing. It's very jarring and confusing. And again, confusion is something you want to try to avoid, at least this kind of pointless confusion. So when you are thinking about your game, you need to consider the connective tissue of how you're moving between different things. But if it's so necessary and it's so obvious that you need it, why does it get overlooked so often? Well, one reason is that when we plan, we tend to try to cut things down into the smallest pieces that we can, because it's much easier to predict how long it's going to take to do this thing as opposed to do the more holistic thing. Now, I think there are a lot of problems with this atomic level planning. Sometimes it's called bottom-up planning, where you start with the atoms of construction and you build them up into wards, into larger and larger things. I think bottom-up planning has its place, but I also think that what you get is precision without accuracy. But because we often do bottom-up planning, we divide our game into as small of pieces as we can get away with. But in the process of doing that, we often miss the place where things connect. When we are planning out the story, we divide it up between all of the different missions and potentially forget to connect the missions together. When we are planning out the different game modes, we plan combat, we plan exploration, we plan the inventory screen, but we don't plan the pieces that connect things together. That's relatively easy to mitigate because you can just include connective tissue in all of your planning. Indeed, you could basically just do this almost automatically, where whenever I add a feature or a user story or an epic that touches another feature or user story or epic, it automatically creates the concept of a connective tissue task that exists between them. And then if I know how this system connects to all of the other systems in the game, I know where I'm going to need all this connective tissue. Pretty easy to at least find it if you remember to care about it. In addition to it being forgotten from a planning perspective, there's a conceptual issue here as well. When I'm thinking about building all of my systems, it's cool to think about how combat's going to work or how exploration is going to work. It's less cool to think about how moving from exploration to combat is going to work. In a story, I want to think about and talk about and plan my beats of things that are happening where the world changes and I make decisions and it's revealed that secretly I'm my own father. It's much less interesting to talk about, now that I've found this out, how do I move on to the next beat of the story? but it's just as important. Indeed, the connective tissue is where a lot of the emotion lives. The beat is where all the action happens and the big revelation occurs, but it's actually in the connective tissue when you're not in the mission anymore that the reflection comes, where you're able to react to what happens and think about what happens. And it's, again, not just about the storytelling. Combat is where all the action is, but it's the connection afterwards where you have the celebration and the leveling up and the other reaction. But because it's less interesting, it's harder for people to engage in the process of thinking about the connective tissue. Connective tissue is critical to us making a game that makes sense, a game that holds together. And often what ends up happening, because it's under-planned and under-resourced, is it kind of has to be pulled together in the final days of the game. One of the reasons why I really like methodologies like Pile of Sand, like the Hourglass, is because you are focusing through some form of real-world playtesting. You are forcing the connective tissue to come into being. You are seeing the thing holistically, and this requires the more systems to exist because you're evaluating the game more as a whole, or at least this part more as a whole, and that starts to draw in this connective tissue. If you allow your evaluations to happen atomically, if you allow your planning to happen atomically, it's very easy for this connective tissue to be forgotten. Don't forget about connective tissue when you're building your game. Build it into your planning process so it gets uncovered as your features come to light, and it gets automatically at least surfaced to be discussed as you are planning things. Remember that this is where your emotion lives, but remember as well that it's also something that most likely gets forgotten by a lot of people. So try to keep it in your mind as you're going around and planning your game and scheduling your game so that it's not jammed in the last second in order to make your game complete. If possible, build your review process in such a way that you are examining things across their boundaries to force the connective tissue to be examined. Don't just play combat in isolation. Play combat starting from outside of combat so you see the transition into combat and then the transition back out on the other side. If you're reviewing a mission, start in the previous mission so you see the connection between the two missions as part of the review process. Build the connective tissue into your processes, into your reviews, so that it doesn't get forgotten, so that it gets elevated and given the attention that it deserves. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have merch. This is, I bought the shirt so Mark doesn't start pumping NFTs. Not a threat, or maybe a threat. If you're interested in buying some merchandise, there is a shelf below this video as well. That helps the channel out. What are some interesting bits of connective tissue that you've seen in games? Ways that they've moved between missions, moved between different gameplay modes. Throw those down into the comments. It's worth learning about ways that different games and different genres approach these sorts of things. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up because that shows YouTube that it's worth sharing around. I will see you again soon. Thank you.